welcome to In Search of the Crystal Skull, an epic adventure into the world of mediocrity. My name is Aaron.
My name is Patricia.
And today we are going to be talking about The Miracle on 34th Street. It is the 1994 version starring Mara Wilson, Richard Attenborough, Elizabeth Perkins, and Dylan McDermott. So, everyone knows the classic Miracle on 34th Street. It was the no, it wasn't 1970s version. Actually, there was a 1970s version, wasn't there, Miracle?
No, the 1947.
1947 version. Don't know why I said 1970s. I guess I've still got James
yeah,
Peach on
there's been
I
a
guess.
lot of versions of Miracle on 34th Street,
Yeah,
that's why.
but this particular version that we're going to be looking at today is the 1994 version starring Mara Wilson as and the law. So the plot basically is the same as basically other Miracle on 34th Street, except with a couple of liberties taken in certain places. So there is a guy in New York City, of course, who is Father Christmas, or Kris Kringle, as he is mentioned in this movie, and he is basically Santa Claus. And he is confronted effectively with a bunch of people who either don't believe in Santa Claus or are actually playing Santa Claus, but play them very badly, and this offends him quite a bit. So he ends up near the Macy's parade, where he meets a Santa Claus who is quite under the table in regards to how much he's drank, and he is very concerned about how Santa Claus is going to be portrayed in this. The organizer of the Macy's parade, who is Dorey Walker, and ends up finding that the Santa is extremely drunk and to the point where he can no longer basically perform the task. So he ends up hiring Kris Kringle for a one-off role, and just out of the blue, and ended up taking on the role of Santa Claus in this parade. He's so beloved in this role that he ends up actually scoring the Santa Claus over at the department store that she works at, and then it turns out that the department store is in danger of basically falling into its creditors, and there's also this kind of like whole scandal that currently also goes on with this revival department store as well. But the new Kris Kringle and the new Santa goes down incredibly well with the people in New York City, but then a disaster strikes as the rival department store sets up a ruse where a guy confronts Santa about being Santa Claus, and ends up getting so under his skin that Kris Kringle ends up actually assaulting the man, who actually it turns out to be the other Santa Claus that he ended up replacing and taking his job. Unfortunately, Kris Kringle ends up in a mental institution until he is then brought to trial to whether he's either going to be declared insane or some miracle might happen that he might actually be considered Santa Claus in all of this. So again, there are some liberty taking towards this. By the way, spoilers by the way if you haven't seen a film filmed in 1994, but this actually has a different ending to compare to the other Miracle on 34th Street in this. The way that this case ends is that Santa Claus is basically says he can be believed in because on the dollar bill it says "In God We Trust," and God is a entity that the U.S. government actually has to believe in because they've written it on its currency and also use it within that. Now there are some arguments about the separation of church and state, but I'm not going to go into that. But basically, that instead of the amount of letters that get sent in and that gets put in front of the judge, in this case it's because the government believes in God and other people believe in God, that apparently they can't, and that is a belief. Apparently the belief in Santa Claus cannot be challenged, and this guy basically is Santa Claus in through that. So I mean, I guess you could say that the newer version I think is a bit more convoluted, I think, compared to the original version, but I don't know.
Yeah,
Patricia,
in
how do
the
you feel
original
about it?
version, the way that they were able to prove that he was Santa Claus was they met up with a mail sorter over at the New York post office. They bring in a whole bunch of mail, and they said, "Oh, well, a whole bunch of kids from all around the world, they mailed their stuff to Santa over at the North Pole, so it acknowledges, according to the U.S. government, that the Postal Service acknowledges Santa Claus, and so that's the proof that Kris Kringle is the real Santa." So, yeah, they do change some things from the original to the remake. In fact, there's several things that they changed from the original to the remake.
Yeah. So, the one thing I'll say about this version of the movie is that I mean, obviously, the classic obviously is the classic, and it is very hard to top this type of movie. But I mean, dare I say, Miracle on 34th Street does try to give like its best performance it can, given what it has to live up to effectively in the classic movie. So, I guess maybe in this discussion, I think maybe we're probably going to have a discussion of whether this version of the movie actually lives up to like the classic movie that we all know and love.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually funny because from the very beginning, this movie was not in terms of, people's opinions and even the producers and even some of the advertisements and, sponsorships was not in the right direction. I mean, a lot of people felt that this was an unnecessary remake. Even Macy's, as you guys know, the department store that was featured in the original Miracle on 34th Street, they wanted absolutely nothing to do with this remake because they felt that the original was the classic and it could never be improved
You
on.
know what? I
And
completely forgot about that. Macy's actually makes no. Yeah, I do apologize about that. Actually, everybody, Macy's makes no mention in this movie at all. It's actually a
yeah,
different department store.
yeah, it's called Kohl's. It's a fictional department store. And as you guys know, it was a rivalry at the original Miracle on 34th Street. It was a rivalry between Macy's and Gimbel's. But because Gimbel's had shut down in 1987, they replaced it with another fictional store called Shoppers Express. And so Kohl's, which is our bargain bin Macy's, because Macy's wanted nothing to do with this, was the one that was doing the Thanksgiving Day parade, and they were the ones who called in this Santa that they just so happened to find in the street because the other Santa was intoxicated to say, "Hey, why don't we have you as our store Santa and meeting up with all of these children that we want to be able to bring in because we're losing sales and we're losing money and." The only way that we're going to be able to survive and not being purchased off by Shopper Express is to have the Christmas sale be our gateway into making all the money that we can. And it becomes really successful. And, a lot of critics hated this movie. They just felt that it was completely unnecessary. There's even this really, really hilarious review that looking back into it is actually pretty funny, where they were saying like, this version of Miracle on 34th Street will never be like, relevant in today's audience. According to what Desson Howe from the Washington Post said, it will not be found on television or its computer equivalent half a century from now. Well, give it about another 25 or 30 years and you'll find it on Disney Plus.
Yeah, but also next to the other Miracle on 34th Street.
Fair enough.
So, I mean, unfortunately, this is a problem with this movie. It can't escape its shadow, and
No.
it's. I mean, you look back at. I mean, there's like a warmness and like I don't know. I don't know what it is. Like again, like the original the Miracle on 34th Street. Even though it's like it's you think today like it's a black and white movie. It looks pretty old and everything like that. But no, it still feels like it has a lot more charm than the newer version of Miracle on 34th Street. Like it's just
Absolutely.
it's.
I mean, you
Yeah.
have amazing actors of their time. Maureen O'Hara, John Payne, Natalie Wood nails it as the little girl who has absolutely no interest in Santa Claus because she was raised to being very serious by her mother because she recently got a divorce and, she has to teach her daughter about the harshness of reality and fantasy is not going to get you towards life. So, yeah, she does a really good job playing as Susan. And, comparing, Natalie Wood to Mara Wilson, I mean, that's going to be really hard, especially with this was around the time in which Mara Wilson was just getting her footing into acting. I mean, this was around the time she was doing Mrs. Doubtfire. This is before she did Matilda. So she was still starting off.
Yeah, and by the way, I mean, like they spared no expense to try and like get this to be as big as the other Miracle on 34th Street. They even hired Richard Attenborough, who played Kris Kringle in this, and like he's a two-time Oscar winner, back in 1984. So like he won 2 Oscars for Gandhi. So like they really tried their best to try and put in like, and also Mara Wilson. I'm not too sure at the time if I mean it was 1994, so I mean she was in that sort of like era of like she did. I mean Matilda came on later on, I believe, and she did Mrs.
Yeah, so
Doubtfire
Mrs.
before
Doubtfire
then.
would have Yeah, Mrs. Doubtfire would have been the newest movie at the time she would have been in.
Yeah, so I mean, like they tried to bring in the who they probably would have thought at the time would have been a safe pair of hands to put this movie into, but unfortunately, I mean, to the critics and to also people who beloved the old Miracle on 34th Street, unfortunately, it was a it was a miracle too far, I guess you could say.
Yeah, a lot of people's complaints about this new version, I mean, the 90s version compared to the 40s version, is that it's very depressing. Like, it just seems like, where's the whimsical of the original Miracle on 34th Street? I mean, where's the scene in which when, all the kids are surrounding Kris Kringle and they think he's the real Santa, and then eventually, Susan warms up to him and then believes that he is Santa. And it is there in the 90s version, but it's a little bit more jaded as opposed to like very whimsical as the original was.
The one addition I actually would do like to see is that they actually included, when he was doing the rounds with the children, is that they included, someone who was deaf. And then they did this moment where it's like, oh, don't worry too much about having to talk to her. She can't really hear. And then Kris Kringle then starts sign languaging over to her, and I think that's a touching moment. I think in
Yeah,
that.
it's very similar to in the original version in which we had a girl who spoke Dutch and she couldn't speak English, and Kris Kringle spoke Dutch and she was really happy and excited that a Santa Claus in New York City in America was able to speak Dutch. So I guess it's parallel to that scene.
So, other people who have roles in this. I mean, Dylan McDermott. He plays Brian Bedford in this, and he is the I guess the sweetheart. I guess you can say of Dorey Walker in all of this. But Dorey in this is don't say you're wrong. Like the Dorey in the original 34th Street was a very cold character in this. Not believing Santa Claus and making sure that her daughter was also the same thing as well. But I guess in the 90s version, I think her version is a bit more like meaningful because she obviously has been felt like she could believe in magic and miracles and things like that when she was with her first husband and when she was in love and then all of a sudden that fell apart and then obviously she was left with Susan. So I think she's like really conflicted. Like I've got this guy who says he's kind of Santa Claus, but then at the same time I've got my own hang-ups as well to kind of worry too much about that, and with my job and everything like that, and also to take care of Susan too. And now I've got Brian who's on the scene, and he's pursuing me as well, and he's just sort of kind of around. So I don't know, Dorey in this version of Miracle on 34th Street, I think is a bit more fleshed out. I think maybe than the original version. Would
I
I dare
mean,
say?
yeah, I guess so because even though that it is true that Doris was the neighbor and she was watching over Susan because her husband had left and she was the only one to take care of her, and Doris and Ryan were neighbors, and that's why he was able to watch over her in the first place. And so they did have a bit of a relationship, kind of like similar to how it was in the movie. I think that this one is a little bit more fleshed out, but for a completely different reason. Like the backstories, even though that they are similar, there are some little tweaks that differentiate it from the original.
Hmm. So, I guess one thing I think that we should probably talk about maybe in this is that, obviously this film got, when it first came out, got very, very harsh criticism. And, I don't know, after watching it now, several decades later, is it still warranted? Some of the hate that this movie got? I want to say,
I guess it also depends on how you feel about the original. If it's kind of like how I've seen people in recent years talk about like a Christmas story or a Christmas Carol in which they've had like multiple sequels and multiple interpretations. It's like if you have a really really strong nostalgic notion about an adaptation that you grew up with that you feel is like really authentic to the source material, and you feel like a new version of it has come out and they do something different to it, then there might be some biases towards how you feel about it. And it's kind of hard to say because there's been a lot of things that have changed in the remake compared to the original. And I would say that there is a lot of subtext that have been changed as well. But it's kind of hard to say about like if this is worse than the original. I think that they both have their strong suits, but I wouldn't say it's like terrible. I would say that it has its own distinctive flavor compared to the original. In fact, I would think that there are some things about it that have improved from the original, but I think that there are some things that, yeah, it just can't match what the original was able to offer.
I,
So,
I just think that the original has had more generations to appreciate it. I think, and I think
yeah,
it'd be interesting to see keep in mind the other one was what? So the other one was from the 40s, wasn't it? So
yes.
will we feel? I mean, how will people feel? After a good couple of decades later about Miracle on 34th Street? The 1994 version. Will they still see it the same way that they do, as we do today? I'm not too sure. It just is.
Yeah, I mean, and especially since we said earlier that both versions are up on Disney Plus, and the 40s version is going to be the one that most people are going to be tuning into.
Right. Okay. So, there are errors in this, and that So, in regards to the character, so when the Judge Harper renders his judgments on the climatic sequence in the end of the film, he mentions that the $1 bill in which he found the words "In God We Trust" was issued by the Treasury of the United States. In fact, the current U.S. banknotes at the time are issued by the Federal Reserve Banks, not the Treasury. So I know that error does not apply in the original 1947 version. At the time, the U.S. Treasury still issued the form of the banknotes called silver certificates. So I mean, obviously there was a bit of a problem in that regard. And also around the 61 minutes, Judge Harper says that he says that the hearing is set for Thursday morning 9 a.m. A.m. means in the morning. He should have said either Thursday morning 9 or Thursday 9 a.m. I guess that's just a bit of a tidbit. I guess you could say. In one bit, when Brian and Dorey go on their date, he is wearing a plain blue wool scarf, but later on in the ice rink, he's wearing a silk scarf with stars on it. So, I mean, it looks like they weren't really taking too much attention, I guess, to the or maybe he always just changed scarf, maybe halfway through. I don't know,
Yeah,
but
probably. I don't know.
yeah, so I mean, there were some glaring problems as well. Also, there's a really unforgivable one. If you think that the Starbucks cup in Game of Thrones was bad. Imagine this. Well, in the psychiatric hospital, there's actually a reflection of the crew member that can be seen in the side of the shiny porcelain sink.
Oh
So,
no.
yeah. So, so yeah. Just in case you want to get taken out at the moment, just look at the sink.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that they added into this movie that just makes it like really depressing. Like the scene in which when we have Brian proposing over to Dory and saying, "Will you marry me?" and she says no. And he says to her, "I've done everything for you. I've watched over your daughter. I've treated you really nicely." And then she says to him, "Well, if you thought that I was going to be taken in just like that, you're a fool." I mean, I could understand from both of their perspectives where, yes, it is true that it was like really, really quick after like who knows how long they've known each other for like a few days or a few months. I'm not.
This is why I was a bit reluctant to bring this up because before I was like, oh, I mean, you can't. I mean, it's like what Elsa of all people I'm about to bring up, from Frozen said, you can't just marry someone you've just met, and it's like, but it's not. We don't know the time frame between the relationship of Dory and Brian in all of this, so we don't know how long they've been with one another. That's the problem. So,
Yeah.
we can't really determine whether it was appropriate not to actually ask her hand in marriage and that. The one thing I will say, though, is that it was a bit, when, they did the whole, Christmas miracle of, Mara Wilson, sorry, Susan, I should say, was asking, Kris Kringle for, a house and they're both to be married and then also a baby brother as well. And then all of a sudden it's we rush into, a marriage, in a barren church and and I made the joke before, at the very end of the movie, it's oh hey, Susan, I bent over your mother at the back of the church, and now you're gonna have a little brother soon. It's
Yeah,
just
I'm
it's.
sorry that ending was just
It
bullshit.
was,
We're
wasn't
based
it?
Yeah, it was. It was complete bullshit. It's like, okay, we're going to basically, have this stock ending in which, oh, they get married. Oh, they have a house. Oh, they live happily ever after. Just like really, really quickly with like little to no buildup. And we already saw earlier in the movie that, she declined on Brian's proposal. So what makes us think that the relationship is going to be salvaged after this?
They
And
needed to do not a flashback. They needed to do a flash forward. At some point to say, oh hey, yeah, like all of this happened, and Kris Kringle, further solidify Kris Kringle being Santa Claus, effectively. And
yeah.
so like I would have accepted that if like it's like a couple of months or a couple of years later even, and then like here's the house and here's like the baby brother and here's like Susan being all happy at Christmas or the next Christmas and stuff like that.
Yeah, like exactly. There should have been like a flash forward to like 1 year later or 2 years later, in which we do get to see the house, we get to see them married, and we get to see the baby brother. That would have definitely justified it for me saying, okay, she was able to get the dream and the wish that she's always wanted. But no, of course not. We just have to have it immediately after Christmas Day, in which both Dorey and Brian see the letter and saying, come over to the church. And then all of a sudden, we have this priest coming along saying, we're here to get married. They could have just easily walked away saying, I don't know what you're talking about, priest. This is a huge misunderstanding. But no, they just went with it. What?
The only thing I could think of, the only reason they probably did that is because like 90s family movies, like they did like once all like the adventure is over and they do like the flash forward is like, oh yeah, everything turned out well, happily ever after. Like the only movie they did that in like Dungeons checks in, way back a dinosaur story. They even did that in Home Alone as well. Like flash forward, like hey, everyone's having a nice Christmas now. And also they did that in Beethoven as well. So some of those like those like 90s family movies that were like taking place around the time Miracle on 34th Street came out, 1994 version came out. So like I mean, maybe they were trying to be a bit different from like maybe the other 90s movies that were kind of like doing the whole flash forward happily ever after at the time maybe.
It's kind of funny that you mentioned Home Alone, because one of the people who worked on this movie was John Hughes, who actually wrote the first two Home Alone movies.
Yeah. And actually, a little bit funny trivia as well. I believe Mara Wilson would also work with somebody else on another particular movie, which I have somewhere. Oh yeah, Robert Prosky and Mara Wilson appeared in Mrs. Doubtfire together in 1993.
That's right, they did. Yeah, Robert Prowski was Mr. Lundy, the television producer, and Mara Wilson was, as we mentioned before, she was the daughter of the Robin Williams character, Daniel Hillard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, like, the only criticism I think I have for this movie, I mean, here's the thing, like, this movie doesn't do anything that's, like, outright terrible. I mean, can we agree about that? Like, besides the marriage proposal, besides, like, all of that, besides, like, the rush towards the ending, I mean, like, it doesn't go do anything, like, massively offensive, does it? Like,
I guess the only offensive thing that some people will bring out is that it just doesn't match the original, which, I mean, of course not. What do you expect?
yeah, I mean, like, if anything, it's like, it's a mediocre attempt, if anything,
Yeah,
compared to the
it's
original.
definitely like a mediocre attempt on a classic movie that people still love to this day.
Yeah, but I'm going to do something really ballsy here, I guess, and like, let's put the old Miracle on 34th Street aside, and let's judge Miracle on 34th Street on its own merits alone. Because, like,
Okay,
it's
then.
we have this rule, don't we, of, like, you don't have to, like, read the source material to figure out, like, to enjoy this movie or not. This movie alone, I mean, Myra Wilson is Myra Wilson in this movie. Everyone else seems to kind of just play, their own character in this much. Like, it's sort of, like, rushed at the very beginning and then rushed at the very end, I guess you could say, and, like, it is filled with a bit of filler, which, is can be entertaining at times, but not so much in other places. And then, like, the whole trial, I mean, like, again, I'm going on the fact that I've been watching Legal Eagle videos and watching a lot of court TV, and, like, so, I have my, obviously, a trial in a movie is obviously very different from a trial in real life. There's, like, all sorts of, like, things that happen in a trial. But, I guess, with everything that's contained in here, I mean, like, there's nothing, like, overly offensive about this movie, but at the same time, there's nothing, like, that would say, make me want to, like, watch it, a second time or a third time or anything like that.
Yeah.
It's just, it seems to be like, okay, watch this movie once and then, after that, never again, if anything.
Right.
So, like, unless it just happens to be on TV at a particular time and there's nothing else to watch.
I mean, to be fair, I don't think you could really make that excuse considering that we have a lot more options to see things
Oh
nowadays.
yeah, like I mean, I guess maybe another discussion we could potentially have is like compare it to other Christmas movies. Like, is this a go-to Christmas movie compared to all the other Christmas movies that were out there in the '90s? Probably not.
We had Home Alone that came out about a few years earlier, so no.
No. All right then. Well, maybe I think we should probably grade this thing and
All
see
right
what we
then.
think. I mean, again, it's like if we put if we put like all the Miracle on 34th Street, comparing it to like the new versus old, put that all to a side. I mean, this is, I would say, an average attempt at a Christmas movie. It's a typical Myra Wilson movie, if anything. So like, it's not like it goes out of its way to like offend massive amounts of people or anything like that. Oh, it's not necessarily like really really bad either. It's just, if anything, it just doesn't live up to like other Christmas movies, and lives up to what the hype potentially was for this particular movie. So I think for me it's a solid 7 if anything.
All right, then I guess on its own merits, I guess on looking into it without the bias of the 1947 version, there's some flaws in this movie, but at the same time, there are some good things in it. But still, I mean, if you're gonna have something like Miracle on 34th Street, one of the biggest cultural icons when it comes to Christmas films, and you're gonna try to see if you can do a new take on it, I mean, for the most part, it just stumbles more than succeeds. So I'm just going to give it a 6.
Right, well, that's another episode for In Search of the Crystal Skull. Stick around, by the way, because we've got some more Christmas movies. Speaking of Home Alone, we have to say, that is going to be our next movie that we're actually going to be going towards, and that is Home Alone, the first movie. So,
All right, then. So until then, we'll catch you later, everyone.
see you later, guys.